You are listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune has a piece entitled, "What is the Rules-Based Order?" In fits of what might be termed masochism, some of us now and then tune into the legacy media. When doing so, one is likely to hear Western-aligned politicians use ad nauseum rhetoric about the linguistically vogue rules-based order. Now and then the word international is also inserted, the rules-based international order. But what exactly is this rules-based order? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the piece continues, the way that the wording rules-based order is bandied about makes it sound like it is worldwide acceptance and that it's been around for a long time. Yet it comes across as a word of the moment, both idealistic and disingenuous. Dr. Horne, this really reminds me of a day during the last Bush administration when I heard President Shrub use the term American internationalism. Talk about this in the context of President Xi, President Putin, President Maduro, and the so many others who don't seem to want to follow this rules-based order.
Well, this so-called rules-based international order, the acronym is RUBIO, R-U-B-I-O, which leads you to Senator Marco Rubio, the diminutive one from Florida. And if you link the rules-based international order to Senator Rubio, you get an idea of what that concept means. In other words, it means, in the first instance, trying to destabilize socialist Cuba, 90 miles from the shores of the empire. And it goes on to indicate that any who might be on the same side, or at least sympathetic to socialist Cuba, should also be destabilized. You mentioned President Maduro of Venezuela, who is one of Cuba's staunchest allies. You mentioned President Xi. Recall that President Diaz-Canel of Cuba just made a lengthy tour. Where did he visit? He visited Turkey, Russia, and China. We also know, given recent headlines out of Havana, that that trip happened to bear fruit because aid is on the way, particularly from Moscow and Beijing. So the rules-based international order, as it has been termed, is a kind of made-up concept. It's a way to circumvent international law. It's a way to circumvent the United Nations Security Council, where Moscow and Beijing sit and have veto power. This is not satisfactory to the United States and its North Atlantic allies. And in fact, there have been rumblings from the European Union, notably Charles Michel, that Moscow should be ousted from the Security Council, which is more than a notion, to put it mildly. So I think that the discerning in your audience should recognize that the rules-based international order is the ultimate and the essence of a concept of propaganda meant to toss dust into the eyes of the U.S. public and the international community and make them unable to see and discern that this concept is no more than a cover for the worst excesses of the U.S. empire.
Another interesting article in People's Dispatch. Ukraine war tolls death knell for NATO. Logically, the option open to the U.S. at this point would be to disengage, but that becomes an abject admission of defeat and will mean the death knell for NATO and Washington's transatlantic leadership goes kaput. Let me add this, Dr. Horne. I don't see how NATO survives this anyway. The cracks in Europe are becoming fissures. The people are struggling. 3 or 4 years from now, I don't see how NATO makes it out of this in the same way that it is today. Anyway, I'll add one other thing. Interesting comments and quotes from President Biden in here in this particular article. But your thoughts?
Well, first of all, with regard to Ukraine, it's quite striking that Washington apparently has an interest in seeing this war continue indefinitely. Washington sees this as an analog to the Afghanistan conflict beginning in the 1970s and continuing, quite frankly, up until this very day, if you discard the idea that the United States withdrew ignominiously about a year and a half ago. That is to say that just as Afghanistan helped to destabilize the then Soviet Union, the idea is that having this unsinkable aircraft carrier on the western border of Russia will be quite destabilizing for Moscow. I don't necessarily disregard that malevolent design, but I think that the NATO partners, the European Union partners in the first place, should recognize that with the United States arming Ukraine to the teeth, and given the fact that there are irresolvable contradictions, in my opinion, between the European Union and the United States of America, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany's wish to continue fruitful relations with China, considering the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which the EU sees as providing subsidies to U.S. manufacturing to the detriment of European manufacturing. Consider as well the energy costs in Europe, which are going through the roof, which makes it more susceptible to being hijacked by U.S. energy producers, which is happening as we speak. I say all that to say that Ukraine could wind up being a cudgel against Germany and against the European Union just as well as it could wind up being a cudgel against Russia. And I'm not sure if the supposedly far-sighted leaders in Brussels are aware of what's available and what's obvious to the naked eye.
When you read this piece, Ukraine War Tolls Death Knell for NATO, it makes me wonder, with the United States continuing to support NATO, how much of this has real military value versus how much of this is really more of a money laundering scheme for the U.S. military-industrial complex?
Well, let's focus on the latter, which I think is quite relevant to raise. Many of us, including myself, talk about the billions being shipped across the Atlantic to the Ukraine at the same time that the homelessness population continues to skyrocket and makes one wonder about the U.S. priorities. But at the same time, I think we need to see these shipments, this tax dollar sum going to Ukraine, as boomeranging and coming back into the pockets of the charter members of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Speaking of Raytheon, speaking of Lockheed, for example, allowing their executives and their top shareholders to buy McMansions in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Falls Church, Virginia, and McLean, Virginia, amongst other lush sites. And so to that extent, once again, the United States, at least a segment of the U.S. ruling elite, has an interest in continuing this conflict indefinitely, to the extent that it's lining the pockets of the 0.0001%. And there's another issue, too, that we should not lose sight of. That is to say, this issue of trying to put a cap on how much Russia can charge for energy. Keep in mind that the not-so-hidden agenda behind this particular gambit is to take away pricing power over petroleum, the lifeblood of the global economy, away from OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led in a titular sense by Saudi Arabia, and OPEC Plus, which includes Russia. The formation of OPEC was a staggering and stunning blow to the North Atlantic countries and their domination over the global economy. Now, with the Ukraine crisis, Washington sees an opportunity to weaken OPEC, which helps to explain, of course, why President Xi of China was just in Saudi Arabia, and also why Russia is beginning to reorient its energy sales away from Western Europe, which is complicit in this diabolical scheme to weaken OPEC, and towards the South, meaning India, and towards the East, meaning China.
But here are my other thoughts too, or another thought on that. If the U.S. if U.S. imperialism was able to effectively control the prices of oil, well, wouldn't they go on to other commodities? I would think that anyone around the world, any group of countries or any organizations or countries that sell any commodities would have to think, well, we've got to resist this because if oil works, next it's gas, next it's whatever, that they would take take that to its furthest extent. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that we're thinking along parallel lines. And I think we also recognize that with regard to other commodities, this could extend down the value chain to something as simple as cocoa and chocolate. That is to say that those particular commodities are produced disproportionately in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and in West Africa. These particular West African nations have had enough of sending their valuable commodity to nations like Belgium and Switzerland and having them make chocolate that is since sold for a pretty penny in North Atlantic markets and in Asian markets. And so they're trying to seize control over this commodity so that they and their peoples, many of whom are suffering grievously, can better survive. Needless to say, this is being resisted tooth and nail in the North Atlantic countries because they recognize what you have sensed, which is that it would be quite dangerous to the alleged domination and hegemony of the North Atlantic countries if those in the global South in particular started to seize control over their valuable assets, meaning commodities. And of course, they're only following the path of Russia, which is one more reason from the North Atlantic point of view why Russia must be destroyed.
And to that point, and it's interesting that you use cocoa or cacao as the example, because we talk about on this show quite often. I think it was Guinea who told Switzerland that they were going to start processing their cacao in-house. Switzerland told them, then we will no longer buy it from you. China stepped in and said, we'll take it. Go ahead and process your raw commodity, and we will take it. And that also makes me think then back on in Iran and Mossadegh saying that they were going to raise the price per barrel of oil so that they could raise the standard of living for Iranians in the 50s. And we know what that brought about. So this is a game that has been played for an exceptionally long time, but now it seems as though there are other forces on the globe, China and Russia to be exact, that can offset the power of the entity, the United States, who wants to now be the unitary hegemon.
Well, that brings us full circle to where we began. That is to say, the critical essence and nature of this conflict in Ukraine, because not only is it a conflict that will determine whether or not NATO can survive, and I agree with the premise that it will be difficult for NATO to survive this conflict, but it also has larger stakes. That is to say, the stakes being who is going to play the dominant role in the global economy. Will it be the case of the last few centuries where the North Atlantic countries led by pirates play that role? Or will we see a resurgence of the global South led by Africa in alliance and in conjunction with Russia and China? If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on the latter.
It's interesting that you use the word pirate, because as soon as you did, that made me think of the Barbary pirates and the whole conflict that the United States had. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I know you are more than well versed in. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.